Part 1. Every story in New Orleans begins with a secret. The year was 1877. The air of New Orleans was thick with humidity and the perfume of magnolia, sweet, heavy, and clinging to the skin like something alive. The war had ended, but the city still wore its wounds. Streets once filled with laughter and music now echoed with the hollow rattle of carriages and the slow creak of shutters that refused to close. At the edge of the French Quarter, on Rue de Lane, stood the Marlowe estate, a mansion of faded grandeur, its white columns stained with time, its iron gates rusting beneath the weight of ivy. The locals called it La Maison du Sang, the House of Blood, though few dared to say why. Inside, the Marlowe family kept to themselves. Silas Marlowe, the patriarch, was a man whose name carried both power and suspicion. Once a celebrated cotton baron, he now lived as a recluse rarely seen in daylight. His wife, Clara, had died years before under uncertain circumstances. Of his children, only two remained: Elias, the elder son, frail, pale, with eyes like fading glass, and Liliane, barely 13, whose laughter was the only sound that dared echo through the house anymore. Rumors spread in the quarter that the Marlowes were cursed. Servants spoke of strange chanting late at night, of red light flickering beneath the cellar door, of Silas walking the corridors whispering names that no one recognized. But money and fear kept the neighbors quiet, and the Marlowes continued their quiet decay. Then one evening, as the summer heat broke into a thunderstorm, the curse began to stir. Elias had fallen ill. It started with fever dreams, visions of something whispering his name from beneath the floorboards. He claimed he heard his mother's voice, calling him to finish the promise. Silas dismissed it as delirium, but when Elias began to bleed from his nose and eyes without cause, the servants fled in terror. Only one remained, a maid named Genevieve, born in the bayou, who had seen enough of the world's darkness to know when it was real. She said the boy's sickness wasn't of the flesh, it was of the blood. That night, she saw Silas descend the cellar stairs carrying a lantern and a knife. She followed quietly, barefoot, and what she saw beneath that house would haunt her until her final breath. Beneath the Marlowe estate stretched a network of tunnels, older than the foundation itself. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of copper. In the center of the largest chamber stood a table carved from stone, etched with symbols no priest could bless. And upon that table, in a basin dark with old stains, Silas Marlowe was cutting his palm open, letting his blood drip into the grooves carved into the rock. He was murmuring a name, over and over, a name that seemed to bend the air around it. Genevieve could not speak it later. She said every time she tried, her tongue felt as though it turned to ash. But she remembered the sound, the rhythm, a word that pulsed like a heartbeat. And as he spoke it, the ground trembled, the lanterns flickered, and from the shadows behind him something moved. Not a man, not quite a beast, a shape, fluid, tall, cloaked in a darkness deeper than night. Genevieve ran, stumbling up the stairs, her breath catching as thunder cracked above the mansion. When she burst into the parlor, she found young Liliane standing at the window watching the storm. The child turned to her with a smile that did not belong to her. "Papa's making us safe again," she whispered. "The house will be happy now." By morning, Elias Marlowe was dead. His skin pale as parchment, his veins dark like ink. Silas buried him behind the estate without ceremony. He told the town his son had been taken by fever. But those who saw the grave said the ground bled when the first shovel struck it. After that night, the Marlowe estate changed. The servants who returned said the air felt thicker, heavier. Doors opened and closed on their own. The mirrors no longer showed clear reflections. Sometimes, a second face appeared beside your own. The family portraits began to darken, the paint cracking around the eyes as if something inside was trying to see out. One evening, Genevieve found Silas standing in the hallway, staring at a spot on the wall. When she called his name, he did not turn. He only whispered, "It's done. It's sealed." Then he smiled, a terrible, lifeless smile, and walked away. She left the estate that night, crossing herself again and again, swearing she would never return. But before she reached the city gates, she looked back. Through the rain and fog, she swore she saw Elias standing at the upstairs window, motionless, watching her go. Years later, when the house finally fell into silence, no one dared approach it. The shutters closed themselves. The garden grew wild, swallowing the iron gates. Children said that on stormy nights, you could still hear a man chanting beneath the ground. And if you listened closely enough, the house seemed to breathe. The oath was written in blood. But who did Silas swear it to? Part 2. Some promises demand more than words. The story of the Marlowe family did not begin in the house on Rue de Lane. It began in blood years earlier, when the South still burned from war and desperation turned men into believers of dark things. In 1864, Silas Marlowe was not yet a broken recluse. He was a man of ambition, charming, calculating, and ruthless in business. His plantations were failing, his ships were gone, and his fortune, once glittering like the chandeliers of his estate, was sinking fast. New Orleans was choking on smoke, and the Confederacy's defeat had left its aristocrats clawing for survival. One night, in a tavern deep in the French Quarter, Silas met a man whose face no one remembered clearly. Some said he was Creole. Others swore he wasn't human at all, too pale for the South, too quiet for a man who drank bourbon like water. He called himself Marcel de Vernay, a name that existed in no record, no parish list, no lineage. But what Silas remembered most was his eyes. They were the color of dying fire. De Vernay told him of an ancient rite, passed down from the old world, practiced in the shadows of Europe before finding its way across the ocean. It was a blood covenant, he said, a pact of prosperity and protection. The ritual was simple in words but heavy in consequence. You will never lose what you claim, de Vernay whispered, but you must feed what guards it. Silas was desperate enough not to ask what that meant. That night, under a sliver of moon and the hum of cicadas, Silas Marlowe followed de Vernay through the swamp. They stopped beside the ruins of an old chapel, long abandoned, half sunk in moss and mud. Inside, candles burned without flame, their wicks glowing with crimson light. De Vernay drew a circle in the dirt using a blade carved from bone. Then, with a voice smooth as silk, he began to speak in a language Silas had never heard. The words pulled at the air like a current, bending sound itself. Silas felt his pulse in his throat, heavy and hot. When de Vernay turned to him, his eyes were black as the bayou. "Repeat after me," he said. And Silas did. He swore his name, his home, and his blood to the covenant. He offered one drop for each, for himself, for his kin, for his legacy. When the knife touched his palm, the blood that fell shimmered unnaturally in the candlelight as if alive. The earth beneath his feet pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and de Vernay smiled. "It is done," he said. "You will not lose. Not while the blood remembers." But as Silas turned to leave, he saw something move in the dark corner of the chapel, a shape standing just outside the circle of light. It was tall, with limbs too long and eyes too many. For a second, it leaned forward, and Silas thought it breathed him in. Then de Vernay blew out the candles, and the darkness swallowed the thing whole. By morning, Silas's fortune began to turn. His ships returned. His rivals fell mysteriously ill. His land yielded twice its harvest. The name Marlowe once again commanded fear and respect in New Orleans. But his wife, Clara, began to change. She said she felt something in the walls, watching, whispering her name when she was alone. Sometimes she'd wake at night to see Silas sitting up in bed, eyes open, murmuring words she didn't understand. Months later, when she gave birth to their second child, Liliane, the midwife screamed. The baby's eyes were bright red for a moment, only a second, before fading to blue. Silas dismissed it as reflection, but the midwife fled and never returned. Then came the first offering. One of Silas's workers was found dead near the bayou, his body pale, his blood seemingly drained. Silas called it an accident. The coroner disagreed, but no one questioned him. The Marlowe money kept mouths shut. That night, Silas returned to the cellar, the same one Genevieve would later discover. He stood before the stone table, now marked with faint veins of red, and as thunder rolled overhead, he whispered, "It is fed." Years passed and the prosperity remained, but always at a cost. A servant vanished every season. A horse found slaughtered, livestock left hollow. The people of New Orleans began to avoid the Rue de Lane house. They said the Marlowes had traded their souls for wealth, that Silas had made a blood oath with something older than the church, older than sin itself. And deep beneath the mansion, the tunnels began to expand, as if the ground itself was making room for something that was still growing. Silas tried to stop. He locked the cellar door, burned the old symbols, and even attempted confession. But the priest who heard it died that same night, his mouth filled with blood. In his final journal entry, Silas wrote, "The guardian is not bound by time, nor by loyalty. It feeds until there is nothing left. The blood was not given, it was taken. And now it remembers." One stormy night, years later, the Marlowe children found that same journal hidden in the library. The ink had faded, but one line remained perfectly clear. "The price of breaking the oath is every drop that bears my name." That was the night Elias began his fevers. That was the night the house started whispering again. The blood oath was never broken, only forgotten. Part 3. Every oath leaves a scar, even on those who never swore it. By the spring of 1877, the Marlowe estate had grown quiet again. Too quiet. The servants moved through its halls like ghosts, whispering about the strange cold that crept into every corner after sunset. The air smelled faintly of rust and candle smoke, and no mirror in the house seemed to reflect clearly anymore. But among all who lived there, only Eleanor Marlowe, Silas's eldest daughter, truly noticed the change. She was 21, educated, poised, and unshaken by superstition. At least she pretended not to be. Her father had died 2 years earlier, found slumped over his writing desk, a half-burned candle at his side, and his veins turned dark as ink. The coroner called it a seizure. Eleanor never believed that. When she inherited the estate, she also inherited his journals. Pages and pages of strange, frantic handwriting, talking about guardians, blood, and the oath that never sleeps. She thought he was mad, until the dreams began. Every night she saw the same image, a man standing waist-deep in the swamp, his face hidden, his voice whispering, "The blood remembers." Sometimes she woke with mud on her hands. In the summer of that same year, the Marlowe estate prepared for a grand gathering, an attempt to revive the family's name. Musicians were invited, carriages lined the gates, and the chandeliers once again burned bright. But beneath the glamour, cracks were already showing. The family doctor refused to come after dusk. The housemaids quit without notice. Even the priest who was meant to bless the property never returned from his first visit. His Bible was later found open in the garden, soaked in blood. Still Eleanor stood tall. "The Marlowes," she said, "will not fade into whispers." That night, during the height of the celebration, lightning struck the oak outside the east wing. The lights flickered, the music stopped, and somewhere below, deep in the cellar, something moved. A low hum began to echo through the house. The guests thought it was thunder. Eleanor knew it wasn't. The next morning, the groundskeeper found symbols carved into the walls of the cellar, the same ones her father had drawn in his journals. But this time they were fresh, wet. And at the center of the floor, the stone slab was no longer empty. Someone, or something, had drawn a handprint in dried blood, smaller than an adult's, larger than a child's. That night, Eleanor sat in her father's study and read one of his final notes again. To end the blood oath, the heir must return what was taken. But he never said how. The more she read, the more her hands began to shake. The last pages mentioned a keeper of the pact, a being bound beneath the estate, neither living nor dead, a guardian that fed on memory and lineage. Her father had called it the Crimson Heir. Eleanor didn't understand what it meant, until she started hearing the footsteps. At first it was faint, just soft tapping in the halls after midnight. Then came whispers through the vents, voices calling her name in her mother's tone, then in her father's. Sometimes she'd find her father's journals moved from her desk to her bedside table. Other times, pages she'd never seen before appeared, all written in her own handwriting. One night, unable to bear it, she descended into the cellar with a lantern. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of metal and wet earth. The walls pulsed faintly as though breathing, and there near the center was the old stone slab again, now cracked and hollowed. Inside it lay a pool of dark, viscous liquid, thick as blood but glowing faintly red. When she lifted the lantern, she saw her own reflection in it, but it wasn't her face. It was her father's. He opened his mouth and whispered, "Feed it, or be fed." Eleanor screamed. The lantern fell, shattering. The fire didn't spread. It sank, pulled downward, vanishing into the blood as if swallowed. When she woke, it was morning again, but the cellar was spotless. No blood, no carvings, no trace of what she saw. Only one thing remained, a single line scrawled on the wall in charcoal. "The heir is chosen." From that day, Eleanor began to change. Her eyes grew distant. She started speaking to no one. The maids heard her whispering names into the dark corners of her room. When they asked who she spoke to, she said, "My brother. He's calling from the other side." But her brother had died at sea 10 years earlier. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Then, during a storm, she ordered every mirror in the house covered. When the servants refused, she tore them down herself, one by one, until not a single reflection remained. That same night, the last servant fled. He claimed he saw Eleanor standing at the end of the hall, her dress soaked, her hands red. But she wasn't holding a lantern. She was holding a heart. Days later, the estate fell silent again. The gates locked, the candles burned out, and the house on Rue de Lane became just another whisper in New Orleans. Another ghost story told in hushed voices about a family that vanished without a trace. Yet sometimes when the fog rolls in from the bayou, locals say they see a woman's silhouette in the window, hair flowing, eyes glowing faintly crimson, waiting, watching. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice carried on the wind. The blood remembers. But some bloodlines refuse to die. Part 4. When the dead are remembered, they remember you back. Autumn crept over New Orleans like a slow fever. The air turned heavy, the streets damp with fog that clung to every lamp and alleyway. But at the edge of the city, beyond the bayou and the broken fences, stood the Marlowe estate, silent once more. For months no one had entered. The iron gates were chained shut, and ivy had begun to crawl across the stone walls like veins reclaiming a corpse. But that silence would not last, because on the night of November 2nd, 1877, the estate came alive again. The lanterns along the front path flickered on by themselves. The old gramophone began to hum, and inside at the long dining table, plates began to fill, with no one there to serve them. It was said that the Marlowes were returning, at least what was left of them. In the city, a few people still spoke of Eleanor. Some said she'd gone mad. Others whispered she'd joined the cult her father once mentioned, the Circle of the Oath. But one man, Reverend Isaac Rowe, refused to believe the stories. He had known the family before the curse took hold, had even baptized Eleanor as a child. When he received a letter, written in ink darker than pitch and signed only E.M., asking him to come to the Marlowe estate for one final supper, he hesitated. But faith has its own kind of blindness. He arrived just after sunset, rain in his coat, Bible in hand. The gates opened without a touch. The candles were already lit. Inside, the long dining table gleamed with silver cutlery and red wine, though the wine, he noticed, was thicker than it should have been. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her skin pale, her eyes sunken but strangely bright. Around her, 12 empty chairs waited, each with a name carved into the wood: Silas, Margaret, Nathaniel, Ruth, and so on. Every one a member of the Marlowe bloodline. "Reverend," she said softly, "thank you for coming. You're just in time for the feast." Her voice was calm, too calm. There was no madness in it, only certainty. Isaac tried to smile, but something in the room was wrong. The shadows on the wall were too deep. The fire in the hearth crackled without smoke, and from the corners of the room came faint sounds, like breathing. He opened his Bible, trying to find strength in the words, but before he could speak, Eleanor raised her hand. "They will not harm you," she said. "They're only waiting." "Who is waiting?" he asked. "My family," she answered, "and the ones who made us what we are." Then slowly she stood. "You once told me, Reverend, that every soul can be saved. Tell me, can you save one that was never truly born?" Isaac took a step back. "Eleanor, whatever you think is happening here." But the air around him rippled, as though the house itself exhaled. The 12 empty chairs began to creak, one after another. Dust lifted from their surfaces, then settled again, shaped like hands resting gently on the table. He could hear whispers, distant and layered, overlapping in dozens of voices. A family speaking as one. "Feed the oath, bind the blood." Eleanor smiled faintly. "They're hungry, Reverend. We all are." And then she began to hum. It wasn't a song, it was a rhythm, a chant older than any scripture. As she hummed, the fire turned blue, the floorboards trembled, and the portraits on the walls began to weep dark streaks down their painted faces. Isaac dropped to his knees, clutching his cross. "In the name of God." Eleanor's voice interrupted him. "He doesn't come here anymore." Suddenly all the candles went out. Total darkness. Then, one by one, 12 faint red glows appeared in the seats around the table. They weren't flames. They were eyes. When the light returned, the table was no longer empty. The chairs were filled, each one occupied by a pale figure dressed in old Marlowe clothing, faces blurred as though half forgotten. Some smiled. Others stared blankly. And at the head sat Eleanor, her hands resting on the table, her reflection visible in the dark wine. But in the reflection she wasn't alone. A man stood behind her, hand on her shoulder. Her father, Silas. "Join us, Reverend," she whispered. It's time. The circle was complete. Isaac turned to run, but the doors slammed shut. The air grew heavy, pressing down on his chest. He gasped, struggling for breath. From the shadows, the Marlowes began to rise. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like puppets guided by invisible strings. And as they stepped forward, their feet left trails of blood on the floor. Eleanor's voice followed him, calm and distant. "The blood remembers, and tonight it will be made whole." He stumbled through the hall, clutching his chest. The walls pulsed like living veins. Every portrait he passed turned to watch him. When he reached the front door, his hand brushed the handle, and something cold seized his wrist. He looked down. It was Eleanor. But her eyes were black now, her mouth bleeding from the corners. "You can't leave," she whispered. "The pact isn't done." That night the storm broke. Lightning struck the estate again, and this time the house burned. Locals said they saw flames rise higher than the trees, and heard screaming that sounded more like laughter. When the fire finally died, only one body was found, Reverend Rose. No trace of Eleanor. But in the ashes of the dining room, investigators found something else. 13 goblets, all still warm, arranged perfectly in a circle, each one filled with blood. And carved into the stone beneath them, a final message. When the 13th drinks, the door will open. And the 13th had yet to drink. Part 5. Some doors are meant to stay closed, especially the ones that remember your name. 3 weeks after the fire, the ruins of the Marlowe estate still smoked beneath the Louisiana rain. Locals said the earth itself rejected that place, that no grass would grow there again. But one night, as the storm rolled across New Orleans, a single light flickered in the ashes. It came from beneath the floorboards, from the cellar. In the city, rumors spread fast. Some said Eleanor Marlowe survived. Others whispered she was seen near the docks, veiled and barefoot, humming a song that made dogs whimper and lanterns flicker. But no one knew for sure, until Detective Henry Corbin was assigned to investigate. Corbin had seen his share of strange cases, cult killings, family suicides, graves that refused to stay filled, but nothing like this. When he arrived at the ruins, he found the air still thick with the scent of burnt wood and something older, coppery, like blood that had never dried. The walls of the cellar were cracked but intact, and there, in the center, was something new. A door. It hadn't been there before. Made of black iron and engraved with the same Marlowe symbols seen in Silas's journals, it pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The latch was sealed by something that looked disturbingly like bone. Corbin should have turned back. He didn't. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrors, all shattered except one. The reflection wasn't his own. Instead, he saw a long dining table, the same one from the old house, but untouched by fire. Candles burned, wine shimmered red, and at the head sat a woman in white. She lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes a dim crimson glow. "Detective," she whispered. "You came." He blinked, and the mirror went dark. Hours later, in the city, people began reporting strange things. The river water near the Marlowe estate turned black. Birds circled the property but never landed, and those who passed by swore they could hear a piano playing, the same melody Eleanor once practiced. Corbin, meanwhile, couldn't leave the site. Something held him there, an invisible weight pressing on his chest, urging him to return to that iron door. He came back the next night. This time the door was open. He descended slowly, revolver in hand, his lantern trembling in the damp air. The cellar floor was covered in ash and old blood, but no footprints. The silence was unnatural, too still. Then came the whisper. "The 13th drinks." He turned. Nothing. Just shadows. He stepped closer to the center of the room and found the 13 goblets, perfectly arranged again in a circle. 12 filled, 1 empty, and beside it, a note written in a hand that matched Eleanor's. To end the oath, the last must drink willingly. The moment he touched the goblet, the air froze. The cellar shook. From every wall, faint figures began to emerge. Translucent, shimmering, faces twisted in sorrow and rage. The Marlowes. They moved toward him, whispering, their voices layered like wind over graves. "The blood remembers. The blood must be fed." Corbin stumbled back, raising his gun. "Stay back." But one figure stepped forward, Eleanor. Her dress was tattered, her eyes glowing faintly red. "You shouldn't have come here," she said softly. "But now you can finish what we couldn't." "What do you want from me?" he gasped. "To close the door," she answered, "before it opens from the other side." She reached out, pressing her cold hand over his heart. Suddenly visions flooded his mind. The pact in 1869, Silas kneeling in blood, the chanting circle, the oath sealed not in words but in flesh. The deal they made with something not human. Silas had begged for wealth, influence, immortality of name. And in return he had promised the 13th heir, one yet unborn, to the entity beyond. Eleanor had tried to stop it. She had taken her own life to break the chain. But the oath lived on in the bloodline. And Corbin was a descendant he never knew existed. The cellar roared as if alive. The ground split open beneath the circle. Red light poured out, liquid fire swirling with faces and screams. The goblets shook, then shattered one by one until only the 13th remained, glowing brighter than all the rest. Eleanor looked at him, tears of blood streaking her face. "You end it now or it ends us all." Corbin hesitated. "What happens if I drink?" Her voice trembled. "You'll seal the door, but you won't return." He looked down at the goblet, the surface rippling like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, dozens of voices chanting, "Drink, drink, drink." He closed his eyes and drank. The moment the blood touched his lips, the light exploded. Every mirror in the cellar shattered, every ghost screamed. Eleanor reached out, trying to hold on, but her hand turned to smoke. The floor gave way, and the crimson light vanished into nothingness. When the townsfolk came days later, the cellar was gone, buried under a collapse of stone and earth. No trace of the door, no trace of Corbin. But the 13th goblet remained, half full. And that night, on the bayou, the fog turned red again. Some say if you stand near the ruins long enough, you can hear the faint echo of a woman's voice whispering through the reeds. The door is closed, for now. Curses don't die. They wait for new blood. And the Marlowe bloodline is still out there.